Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So, okay. So very good. So yeah. So then let's begin. And I'm very happy to see that today we have a really big crowd of people here in person in Tartu. So yeah, it's very nice. And also there are already some people online. So I think we can definitely begin. So I will then welcome you to this our fourth session of Semiosalong. So today we have two. Oh yeah, sure. So today you can see here the very big audience. And so today we are going to have two presenters, Josh Bacigalupi and my good friend Oscar Miyamoto, and I'm sure they will deliver very interesting presentations. So, as you know, we are going to have presentation and questions, and then presentation and questions. We are recording this session. It is already being recorded. So in case you don't want to appear in the recording, you can just let us know, and we will edit you out. You can, of course, post your questions at any moment in the chat, or the end of each presentation, you can just open your microphone and ask your questions. And so, yes, I guess that's all I have to say. And now I will just leave you with Josh. But first, just a few words about Josh. So he studied environmental science and physical chemistry at UC Santa Barbara. He then went on to study architecture, and he has a degree also from the University of Colorado. And he has been working with Professor Deacon in Berkeley. And currently he has just joined our department as a PhD student under the supervision of Kalevikul. So yes, I think most of us here, at least most of us who are involved in the biosemiotics community, already know Josh, and so yes, it's very nice to hear him now in the context of Semiosalong. So his presentation is called Synécheia, Continuous Becoming via Ethical Habits and Aesthetic Ends. So please, Josh.
Great, thank you, Israel. Really glad to be here. Let me share my. I made a. Can you see my slides? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Great. I made one very slight yet significant change to my title, to the last word, to aims, to aiming, and I hope to make that the reason for that change more clear throughout this this talk. So to begin, I'm going to split the talk into three sections. Going to start with a question. I'm going to focus really mainly on. I'm going to steer the question of Synécheia to Peirce's synechism, and so the first section will raise sort of that question of, from Peirce's perspective, what is synechism, and you know the real quick answer is the synthesis of pragmatism and tychism. Of course, that just raises even more questions. So then the next section will dig deeper and propose an immediate triadic medium, and I'll explain what that is in that section, to introduce and explain this synthesis of growing reasonableness, or a sort of a quick catchphrase for pragmatism, and fortuitous chance, and a catchphrase for tychism. But these are just necessary I believe, necessary and not sufficient sort of explanations for synechism. So then the last section, based on this medium that I'll explain in the second section, we'll go further to explore the sufficient conditions for synechism's growth in reasonableness. And I'll explain what I think Peirce means by reasonableness in the context of pragmatism. Okay, start with a quote. Let me just minimize this guy so I can read my own slides. Okay. Synechism is founded on the notion that the coalescence, the becoming continuous, the becoming governed by laws, the becoming instinct with general ideas are but phases of one and the same process of growth and reasonableness. He goes on to say, it is that synthesis of tychism and pragmatism for which I long ago proposed the name synechism. So just a quick highlight here, synechism is a process of becoming of some type and a process of growth in reasonableness. But again, what is synechism in practice? We could say pragmatism and tychism, but again, what are those? Okay, so I'll come back to tychism, but focusing on pragmatism for now. The importance of the matter for pragmatism is obvious. Peirce's, yeah, our friend Peirce. We'll work on that obvious, hopefully, through this talk. For if the meaning of a symbol consists in how it might cause us to act, I'd say ethically, it is plain that this how cannot refer to the description of mechanical, or I'd add dyadic, motions that it might cause, but must intend to refer to a description of the action as having this or that aesthetic aim. In order to understand pragmatism, therefore, it is incumbent upon us to inquire what an ultimate aim capable of being pursued in an indefinitely prolonged course of action can be. Okay, that's a pretty loaded, I think a really important philosophical statement right there, this whole idea of some ultimate aim. I mean, it's kind of been the holy grail, I think, for philosophy for quite some time. If anyone's philosophy touches on teleology in any way, shape, or form, you will have asked yourself, what is there and what is an ultimate aim? Now, we could start with, in interrogating this notion of an ultimate aim, we could start with just the empirical fact that life has been continuous for about 4 billion years, but it still leaves the question open, does it have an ultimate aim? In other words, in order to sustain what is obviously a very rare and amazing phenomenon in the universe, does it have to have some kind of ultimate aim in order to sustain that process? Now, in this case, this was the end, if you will, of my semiogenesis talk in 2021. So I'll start here. If we presume these growing umwelts, so when these parabolae here, what I'm suggesting is that over the time, let's just assume for the moment that this trajectory here is of a single agent, and that over time as it develops, whether physically or even over evolutionary time, like a species, that we could generalize this idea of developing umwelts. And then, of course, within a lifetime too, humans learning, they're expanding their umwelts, I'd suggest, and I'll try and make that case. So if we presume these growing umwelts, what are they continuously growing towards? What guides their growth? An intrinsic self? Or is an agent about its surroundings? Is it the self, or is it non-self? The surroundings. I'd argue it must be both about itself and not self. This sort of absential idea that's central to semiosis. Both in a temporal development and spatial organization. So both over time, and in any given moment, what's present and what's not present. So as Ivan Froman, hopefully I pronounced that right, Ivan, quoted last time from Peirce, quote, "Nor must any Synechist say, I am altogether myself and not at all you." So where I think Peirce is leaning is, and certainly where I'll lean, is that we must somehow be both. We must somehow both be about ourselves here and now and about something else, something else, somewhere else, and somewhen else at the same time, simultaneously. But is this not a contradiction? I mean, this has been through, from Aristotle, well, even the presocratics and to now. And according to classical logic, this is a contradiction. Like, how can, there's a catastrophic sort of change from moment to moment. We're it's the classic Heraclitian river. Like, not only do we not step in the same river twice, that the river is continuously changing, but we still consider it the same river. But that we ourselves, I think, embedded in Heraclitus's initial sayings, is that embedded into that is the notion that we ourselves, the person stepping into the river, also changes and is not the same person, yet we consider them the same self. Okay, so to get just an intuition for how this contradiction might be possible, I'll dip really quickly into quantum mechanics. Don't worry, we won't really stay here. It's just to sort of generate some intuition, but based on empirical evidence. So in principle, here's how that contradiction could possibly be resolved. So there's this continuous noise, if you will. I'm using the term loosely, but in quantum mechanics, this continuous band of waveforms down here is an infinite collection of wave functions, and in quantum theory, these constructively and deconstructively interfere, such that in sort of a specific, well, again, space and time aren't we can't really talk about that yet, but that there are these, the birth of particles, so to speak, is where constructive superpositions of these infinite waveforms superpose, and elsewhere is deconstructive. So what we have here is sort of the both and, where we have simultaneously, which is critical, that simultaneously we have a continuity and a distinctness. Okay, so that each particle is a distinct phase, if you will. Let's just use the term phase for now instead of a thing, but like that there are these that the phasic relations constitute then this jump into what we observe as events. So that I think Peirce, one of the quotes I just quoted, said, talks about phases of one and the same continuous process. So that's what I just tried to describe, and that they are punctuated continuity. Events are distinct and interrelated simultaneously. That's really important. But this doesn't really get to this growth of reasonableness. A continuous, if phased growth of the Umwelt, what is that? How is the Umwelt simultaneously about itself and its surroundings through time? Okay. So seeking some ultimate aim is always tempting, but Peirce later in this section suggests it's unattainable, and I would agree. I'll read this one. So he says that in order that the aim should be immutable under all circumstances, excuse me, without which it will not be an ultimate aim, it is requisite that the aim should accord with a free development of the agent's own aesthetic quality. This is going to become a really important concept, the idea of aesthetic quality. At the same time, it is requisite that the aim should not ultimately tend to be disturbed by the reactions upon the agent of that outward world which is supposed in the very idea of action. So that's a lot. What I interpret that to mean is that you simultaneously have the agent's own sort of sense of self, aesthetic quality, aesthetic aim, intent, trajectory, but that simultaneously that trajectory, that notion of self, will be exposed to in a surroundings that may or may not be aligned with the trajectory of that self, and may perturb that self and challenge that self. And that Peirce is pointing out that these two things are in tension, that we have to reconcile these two things, that these two conditions can be fulfilled at once only if it happens that the aesthetic quality toward which the agent's free development tends, and that of the ultimate action of experience upon him are parts of one aesthetic total. Okay, so pardon my intonation there. So what I think he's saying here is that these two conditions must, the sort of so-called internal and external, which are problematic, but I'll just use them for where we are now, have to be reconciled somehow into one aesthetic total. Okay. Let me just look at my notes really quickly here to make sure I don't miss anything important. Yeah, okay, so it is unattainable. So as I said before, Peirce later in this same section says that this is probably unattainable, this notion of this kind of ultimate aim. It is unattainable insofar as the aim itself is immutable. This idea that it's an immutable aim, that it's a fixed aim. What can stay constant, however, is the habit of aiming. Not a single aim, right? So that there are multiple aims and that they evolve. And this is why I changed, my title, that it's aiming and not aims, singular aims, but a continuity, a continuous evolution of aiming. In this way, quote, the aesthetic quality towards which the agent's free development tends must evolve. The next section will explore what this aesthetic quality composed of parts of one aesthetic total is. And then the final section will explore this idea of how these unique aesthetics evolve. Okay, so moving on to the next section. All right. I want to make a key distinction here. In essence, well, certainly this section turns on the content of this slide. So what I want to do is make a distinction between dyadic and triadic, right? So that what is a aesthetic quality that is necessary for aiming requires this argument that Peirce makes, that triadicity is not reducible to dyadicity. I think that's just so critical. And what I would suggest is that, and I can't claim that Peirce would back this up. I've looked for it and I haven't quite found it yet. But what I'd claim is that within triadicity, as soon as you move to triadicity, you have the opportunity for an affective field, or what I call or what we would call the agent's own aesthetic quality, what Peirce calls the agent's own aesthetic quality. And that in the dyadic case, whether it's communication theory, a sender receiver, or behavioralism, stimulus response, or any other sort of stepwise diagrammatic approach, we presuppose the relations. And what I want to suggest is that when we move to triadicity, it opens up the opportunity for flipping that, in the sense that relationships can emerge, and I'm talking about like radical emergence, like how it is that relationships can emerge. And in this case, I'm talking, what I've done is I've collapsed the sort of stimulus response sender receiver model into each of the nodes, so that each node has its own thisness, each is unique, each is radically unique, in the sense that no two nodes will have the same affinities or sensitivities, and that they are each both senders and receivers simultaneously, and that they have this interstitial virtuality, if you will, or affective fields. There's lots of different terms we can come up for, we could come up with for it. But I suggest that this is the critical thing that's really missing and I'll talk about later how it, Valsener's flow of experience, for example, like his little sketch that he always has at the bottom of his diagrams, like all the squiggly lines, that's really critical, that's really important to understanding really what triadicity has to offer. And the beauty is you don't need, quadradicity, or, you don't need to go more, because as I think Peirce argues, triadicity can, once you've established this virtuality at triadicity, it can increase in dimensionality. So these other little diagrams over here are just making further the point, this idea that there's each node, if you will, has its own sensitivities, as I was saying, so that they're sensitive to certain things in the environment, and that they will, emote in some way into their shared interstitial field, this virtuality, this aesthetic quality, this affective field. Sorry, there's just lots of different terms that I found that could refer to this, but that they each have their own unique perspective. They both mold and are simultaneously molded by this shared field. Yeah, and just to repeat that, because that's really important, that this affective field both molds and is molded by each unique node to irreversibly manifest a unique will, the agent's own aesthetic quality, to use Peirce's phrase. Okay, this is just to maybe render it a little bit more practical. We have over here, I don't know if you guys recognize this, is the model of trichromatic vision in humans. And the idea is that in your retina, you would have individual cells that are distinct amongst all other cells for being uniquely sensitive, and that their unique sensitivities then come together and create unique populations. And then these unique populations then overlap in sort of a scale invariant way to create the ability for us to discern upwards of 10 million different hues and intensity, and on into, spatial relationships, et cetera. So this is really amazing. And what I want to suggest is that it starts with, let me go back. It starts with, the sort of continuous overlapping distributions of sensitivity. The key being that the continuity is engendered. You have both the distinctness and the interrelation, as I was arguing before, and that via this capacity to mold this common interstitial medium, it can build hexaides upon hexaides, or patterns upon patterns, to expand the Umwelt into ever more complex semiosis. Yeah, so just to review my notes, and these overlapping distributions of affect are affect meaning like their sensitivities, are simultaneously iconic and indexical, creating phenomena like magenta, for example, that are truly emergent, truly semiosic. So in other words, magenta isn't a phenomena that exists out in the world, beyond humans. That magenta is something that's literally generated through a semiosic process. And it's fundamentally iconic in the sense that there's affinities for, say, blue and with these populations like blue and red, but it's their indexicality, the fact that they happen together and that they interact and such that they generate this tertiary, this higher order phenomena, magenta. Okay, so this is again just furthering the point. This is a slide from previous work, and then that I talked about in more detail in my semiogenesis talk in 2021, last year. But it's just further making the point, or trying to ground, if you will, what it is this interstitial field might be in reality. So in this case, it could be, well, in the brain, it could be electromagnetic fields, it could be chemical ionic gradients, it could be acoustic, it could be water, it could be literally water waves. So the point is that each of these darker nodes have their own unique sensitivity to their environment. Then they respond uniquely to a shared environment, But then what they do is that they generate from this common medium what am I doing on time? Good. Okay. Generate a common, in this case, like this interference pattern, right? So that you have this constructive interference that creates a more salient figure in the ground, if you will. So that this figure rises above the noise floor. And forgive me, but it was a conceit. This white area seems like it's noiseless, but it's actually quite the opposite. And I'll talk more about this later. But for clarity for the diagram, I sort of rendered this whiteness. But think of this whiteness as white noise, that this whiteness is noise, and that this signal, if you will, this constructive interference is rising above the noise floor to become a salient feature that the agent can again sense. So not only is it sensing these individual nodes in the environment, these individual frequencies in the environment, it's now sensing its own iconic and indexical interrelation, semiosic process, its own, that this interference pattern embodies iconicity and indexicality that can then further be felt and leveraged in order to create biases, so that these biases can then become sort of like a final interpretant, if you will, that they then bias the system such that it's not only sensitive to just these individual nodes one at a time independently, but that higher order patterns, it becomes sensitive to higher order patterns based on those more simple patterns. Okay. All right, so I think this is the last slide for section 2. So there's a bit here. What I want to argue, and now this is me trying to understand Peirce, or elucidate Peirce through the lens of this kind of heuristic model, if you will. So allow me to go back just to make this more clear that this, take this element in your mind, this triadic element with its affective field. And then what I've done is I've made this an immediate object. It's like an instantaneous feeling, if you will. It's a slice. It's a sectional instantaneous slice through the semiosic process, and that it's as I said, analogous to an immediate object. This diagram, by the way, is adapted from Don Favreau's 2015 paper on the relevant next, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second, which is further built off of El-Hani's et al.'s 2013 paper on how the immune system works. And what's interesting is that El-Hani makes the case in his paper that you have the immediate object. In other words, O1, O2, O3 are these immediate objects that I would suggest, and I think he would too. Well, yeah, he certainly would, that these evolve, right? That these change through time. And I try to represent this by their varying colors changing. But that simultaneously what's happening is there's a dynamical object, right? And that this dynamical object is more continuous in nature, that it's continuous semiogenesis, the development of new signs, and that the immediate objects and the dynamical objects are well, like most everything in Peirce's model, are irreducible, like they're of each other. Like, as I was saying before with the nodes and their interstitial field, the immediate object both molds and is molded by the dynamical object, but this dynamical object is more spread out, or is Winifred Noth, I think I agree with his sort of quick little catchphrase for that, it's a network of relations. I hope I don't misquote him, but and then really importantly, a lot of times there's confusion, like Don Favreau has insisted that the object is not a thing out in the world. But many semioticians would disagree, like Crampon here, for example, in his classic paper, Models of Semiogenesis, he specifically says that, yeah, the dynamical object is something outside the organism. I just don't see how that could work. I mean, we should continue to have that conversation, but insofar as the argument I'm trying to make here, what I want to suggest is that there is a very important distinction between the immediate object and the dynamical object, but that the dynamical object while certainly being very affected by the surroundings, as I just illustrated with the example of vision, for example, that it is a series of network relations that evolve so that you'd have this instantaneous notion of, say, water, for example, like you're drinking water. If I drink water here and water, but then maybe someone mentions the ocean, and then that immediately flips, we could still say it's a dynamical object of water, but I've gone from the instantaneous sort of contextually relevant notion of water here in my glass to imagining being at the beach. And that I would suggest moves into this more continuous, more distributed network of waterness, if you will. So there's that argument. And then if you grant me that, then we can talk really quickly. I can mention how there's this notion of this continuous relevant noise, like that white area that I talked about here. Think of that as like white noise that just goes through the system. And again, I kind of got rid of it here, but that's not quite right. Like, there is this noise that's truly continuous, but the noise changes. Like, it changes in its complexion. It changes as it evolves. But what is really important is that we have, I think this is a good spot to explain Don Fabreau's relevant next, so that you have this noise, this ambiguity, this default mode network, for example, in the brain. It's like daydreaming, right? You're daydreaming, and then it's like you get a hunger pang or something that is a constraint on all of this infinite possibility, and that really rather quickly reduces the infinite possibility to what I would suggest, or Calevi-Cool's notion of free choice, that one or a very few discrete number of possible, very salient options become available, and that action can be predicated on those, and then some final interpretant emerges, and then either it moves on to immediately another one, or you just go back to daydreaming. And so in this sort of sketch here, what I'm showing to match this diagram is this very sort of rigid rhythm of being in the noise, in the daydreaming, and then having a salient final interpretant, and then going back to the noise. And that this oscillation, this rhythm, is really critical, is really important. Right, so I should move on. Right, so this triadic or semiosic medium is necessary. This medium up here, which is a section, let's say, through this noise here, is necessary, but not sufficient to explain this agapistic, what I suggest is agapistic evolution. So that's the final section here. Okay, so I'm going to try and blow through this in 6 minutes. Let's see. Right, so what I've done is I've retaken our new friend here, and suggested that based on this affective field with infinite, this sort of the infinite virtuality of tykism. Now I'm going to bring back in quickly tykism in the last section here, that I'd suggest that this tykism is not pure chance, that it is of an infinite possibility space. It is indeterminate, but it does actually, it does get cultivated. The idea that you could generate, that you could literally generate your own luck via this relevant noise. And it's relevant because, again, it's contextual, and each of these nodes, you can imagine the whole brain, however many billions of cells that have their own sensitivities, that perk up given a particular context. And that could be a self-generated context. Like, very importantly, that this is a self-generated context that I'm suggesting does that both and work of being simultaneously about what we could point to as the agent and the agent's future, the agent's surroundings, et cetera. And that in that tension, along the lines of the interference that I pointed to earlier, the salient interference patterns, that you can begin to form, maybe instead of diagrams emerges, we could say that habits emerge, that the final interpretant is accrued based on abductive affinities, which inform the dynamical object. And then importantly, the finite actions of pragmatism are the ethical actions aimed by the agent's own aesthetic qualities. So the aesthetic qualities are these, this interstitial is predicated on the existence of this interstitial triadic medium. Let me check my notes again. So the final section explores, the evolution of the aesthetic reasonableness of our aiming, the sufficient conditions for synechism. And a shout out to Don Favreau for this notion of aiming, because he's the one that has repeatedly talked of aiming. Then we have expanding umwelt via affinities. Each node feels the affective field it both affects and is affected by. And based on these affective feelings, network biases, in other words, final interpretants, I suggest, can accrue. Okay, so kind of to move towards the punchline, if you will, that this is semiogenesis, the argument that I made last year, and that this umwelt, this parabole here could mark the umwelt. But what is important is that these rhythms I was talking about earlier, these rhythms, going from the noise, from the decoherence to coherence, and then back to decoherence, it clearly can't be arbitrary. It has to evolve in a certain way. And in fact, that you could go too far. And this is really critical. And that this is sort of the point of this final section is that you could go into what I call these death states, if you will. And all I mean by that is that once you go beyond a given, say, agent's ability to sustain coherent signals or to sustain decoherent signals. In other words, you could imagine like an extreme example in the human mind would be schizophrenia over here and decoherence, like the noise and the mind just overwhelms the signal. And then over here you have epileptic seizure, where a single signal dominates, oppresses all the other noise. So that there's this annealing schedule between choice and noise, coherence and decoherence, and that it has existential implications throughout the scale invariantly from agents all the way up to society. So then the big question is like, okay, that's all fine and good. You should avoid these death states, but how do you do that? And yeah, so the second to last slide, and bear with me as forgive me for going just a little over time. What's important for what we've got to figure out is that how it is that we get to these sort of danger zones, if you will, that there's ethical action in a sense, just moving, as long as you can move in a way that there are these salient signals to harvest. We could say that, okay, well, I can keep moving in this more or less direction, acting and then reflecting, making choices, and then considering options, taking in input. But you could only do that up to a certain point where things just begin to either decohere or overcohere. And I'll mention some examples of that shortly. But the idea is that we can turn away from these death states by feeling the interstitial noise, and that the infinite virtuality of tychism generating one's own luck from minority voices in the noise. So that sort of ironically, by you avoid these death states by listening to the minority voices. So I'll just really quickly mention a couple of examples of how we might think of this. So whether an individual is fatigued by overstimulation or bored by repetition, work pathways are mitigated in each of those sort of extreme experiences. In the first case, they are mitigated by ambiguity and confusion. When you're overstimulated, you're fatigued, you're tired. In the latter, they are mitigated by the dominance of a singular repetitive stimulation. Taken to the extreme, as I suggested, we have schizophrenia and epileptic seizures, respectively. At the social scale, mob rule dissipates robust work pathways able to coordinate complex tasks, just as despotism inhibits the diverse sensitivities and habits necessary for complex adaptive work. In either case, available work pathways are mitigated, which means that power, the rate at which energy is consumed, decreases. And this could be felt by the system itself internally as the nature of that noise, that sort of white noise, changes. And it's felt via this triadic medium, a medium that can be about both the self and that which is non-self simultaneously. Okay, so last slide. So the conclusion really, as I alluded to earlier, is that that there isn't an ultimate aim, but perhaps becoming can exist, semiosic becoming can exist via continuous aiming, by navigating these death states, by feeling the affective field, the horizon of reasonableness can be expanded. These expanding umwelts cannot have an ultimate aim because it depends on where one is in one's parabola. But by annealing rhythmically and relevantly, the semiosic system at each scale becomes via continuously enacting ethical habits via aesthetic aiming. So to sum it up, annealing synechism, if you will, the becomings are but phases, to quote Peirce again, are but phases of one and the same process of the growth of reasonableness. Thank you.
I hope you listened to the applause. And yes, so now thank you very much, Josh, for a very nice presentation. And now questions. So you can come here and ask your questions.
I don't want to ask questions, so I want to be a first one. I don't. So, hello, a nice presentation.
Thank you.
Very impressed, and I got curious when you mentioned this ultimate aim. Let's say in the Peircean term, can ultimate aim actually be, let's say, the interpretant? And for me, this continuity you mentioned was like a semiosis. What do you think about that? Can we make that comparison?
Yeah, I think we can. It's just we'll always find ourselves sort of challenged with, when we say make the move, as you suggest, from ultimate aim to final interpretant or just interpretant in general. Then that begs the question, okay, well then what's the nature of that interpretant? What's the context in which that interpretant is doing something adaptive or not adaptive? And how does the system incorporate feedback in such a way that the way in which it interprets will have to change, will have to evolve as it's challenged with, for example, we're challenged with new input all the time that can actually completely undo everything that we previously held as our identity, for example, and that we have to. Semiosic processes, in order to have sustained themselves for so long, have to have figured out a way, or evolved a way, I should say, to adapt the nature of interpretation, how the interpretants are generated, and that it's contextual, so that we're still, we could say that, we could make that connection, but then we still got to answer the further question of how the process of how interpretants evolve given the indeterminate open system that they're immersed within.
Yeah, and just another smaller question.
Yeah.
do you think like we human beings throughout our life have more than one ultimate aim? Like, because like, let's say we have this one goal, and when we achieve it, like ultimately we like want to do something more, like we want to like create some other ultimate goal. Like for me, like when coming here to Estonia, to Tartu to study semiotics was once my ultimate goal, but now I have like, let's say, more ultimate goals.
Yeah, well, in a way, yeah. I mean, that's sort of the absolutely. That is exactly illustrates the point that the old saying, you don't want to rest on your laurels, right? In that diagram I had, where you're sort of just moving from one side of the parabola to the other side of the parabola, we could think of that loosely as like, oh, I'm on my way to this ultimate goal, but then either you achieve that goal or you reach there's any number of reasons or circumstances where you've got to fundamentally and radically change those ultimate goals, and that you have to have that within you, the capacity to resolve that often rather painful phenomena of radically changing your course of action in order to stay on course, right? But course is like, what course? The course evolves with the act of following the course.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello. I noticed that in some of the reference accompanying the images or the graphics, there is a mention of the word Kubernetes that is related to this Greek word about navigator or steerman. And it makes reference to this loop between getting information and acting on that information in order to steer your course towards a certain aim. So can you develop a little about how that, what is the role that this word plays in that? It makes me curious.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great question, because I'll just generalize, Kybernetes, like the Greek word to the contemporary notion of cybernetics, so that, which is a critical development on I think our understanding. You look at Rosen's work on anticipatory systems, and I mean it's so deep, the cybernet. I mean, we were basically immersed. We're the inheritors of the cybernetic. That cybernetic heritage, and I think there's a lot to learn from there. However, I'm very much want to move on from cybernetics, not get rid of it. That's not what I mean, but there's certainly feedback loops throughout. But the feedback loop itself, I would consider as very law-like, is really very moved very far, if not completely, into the mechanistic realm of an algorithm, right? Peirce's acausal, right? So he has the degenerate cases of tychism and acausal, the algorithmic. And what I want to suggest is that this interstitial medium, like how is it that this, like the last question, this notion of an ultimate aim, like the cybernetic system has built into it an ultimate aim. It can't evolve its own. What I would argue, living systems have an infinite capacity to generate novel aims, and that our cybernetic systems today, they don't have that capacity, and that we could talk. I'd love to talk more and more about neural nets and recursion and all of these very powerful computational tools, mechanical tools, but none of them have this interstitial field, if you will, this noise, this ambiguity, like the embracing of the semiosic ambiguity, to then generate ever new cybernetic pathways.
Okay, thanks. I think it's
I think, yes, Miriama, please.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good, thank you. So I'm not quite sure if this question makes sense the way I want to ask it, but I wanted to ask if you think that like this solitary ultimate aim in people is an inevitable thing, or whether it would be possible to have multiples based on like different societal pressures in like different contexts, or if everything will eventually come like to a single point, even maybe subconsciously, because everyone is driven towards a single ultimate aim of becoming. I'm sorry, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That absolutely makes sense. Well, and it's very related, I think, to the last two questions, and this idea that, well, this question of like, is there an ultimate aim, or do we fundamentally have multiple aims that evolve? And I think that humans in particular, because we are unique in our semiosic mode of being, and our emphasis, our sort of radical generation of symbols, we really live in the symbolic, arguably more than any other species on the planet, that we run the risk of sort of believing our own aims a little too much. Maybe what would be Tyler Bennett's Tartu science, for example, perhaps. That we take, I think that we have a tendency to hold on, whereas animals, I think they move a bit more freely and contextually, inspired by the context, the environment. That's why no other animal is like, threatening the entire environment of the planet. But because we have kind of dissociated ourselves from the more iconically and indexically bound relationship with the planet, we have a tendency to believe a little too hard in an ultimate aim. And I think Peirce suggests, and I'll certainly argue, that we don't actually have an ultimate aim, and that we have to be better at the societal scale of generating not only novel but adaptive and reasonable aims given the current context. I don't know if that answers your question, though.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from here, from people?
Was there one in the chat?
Yeah, we have one comment by Amelia.
Oh.
Yeah. Also praising your presentation.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Amelia.
Okay, but then if not, maybe we can move on to our next presentation. Wait, we have one more question.
Well, I was going to ask, I mean, you, in one of your early slides, you counterposed the Peircean semiosis, the Peircean approach to semiology, in a pretty kind of typical way, showing the dyadic semiology and can't account for this potentiality, but the triadic Peircean way is the way. And I mean, I guess I want to prod Israel a little bit. One of our missions has been to recuperate structural semiology, and to what extent maybe it can account for the same dynamic potential meaning, but through a different way. I assume that you don't have an answer for that question, Josh, but what about you, Chavez?
Well, actually, I had a question for Josh, but I decided not to ask it, but the question was related to that, because in the diagram, there was this sort of contrast between dyadic and triadic. And I noticed that semiology was there as a dyadic thing. But then there was a very nice remark that you made, I mean you, Josh, about the dynamic object being informed sort of by interpretants, and not as the dynamic object, not as something as exists out there, but as something that is actually informed by semiosis. And I think this is just very much a semiological position, because this would be a sort of, so at least in my view, and I think at least Bennett agrees, I think this is mostly about, well, manifestation in a way, like this relationship between form and substance, in which substance manifests form. So
I'll just, if you don't mind, quickly respond. I think that well, first of all, you guys know semiology way better than I do, and I have a lot to learn, and I look forward to that. And I think what I'm wondering, or I'm begging the question, if you will, that, or I'm suggesting, I'm arguing that semiology is a subset of Peirce's semiosis, triadic semiosis, meaning that how it is our dyadic relations emerge is predicated on a triadic process. And so point being is that cybernetic systems or anything that systems that you guys are suggesting, it doesn't refute those things at all. But it does dig deeper into how it is they can generate themselves, how it is they can evolve themselves, how it is they can resolve the tension between the self and non-self, between the present and the absential. Like, these are tensions that I definitely am happy to be informed on how it is like a semiological approach can address those conundrums for sure.
Yes, and I hope there will be more talk about this very soon in the Czech Republic.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, yes. I was promised good wine.
Yes, because we are all going to be there. And so, yeah, we should really talk about this, because this topic, it's something that Tyler and Ludmila and myself, we've been very much working on.
Yeah.
Sometimes separately, sometimes in a way together, and also Villamoto, which is here. So it's very good, at least in some occasions. But okay.
Yeah, I just want to, if
yes,
I can
please.
very shortly also react to this question, because it's so very important for our group. But first of all, thank you, Josh, for a very nice presentation. We really like your graphics and the very colorful diagrams. That's really nice. And just quickly answer Taylor's question. I think that you are right, Josh, that we can put together Peirce semiotics and structural semiology, but maybe I'm not sure if the only way is to understand structural semiology as a subset of Peircean semiotics, because I think this is kind of hierarchical understanding of the problem. And I think we can also see it the other way around and understand some of semiologists as triadic. For example, we can find a lot of triadicity in Hume's lab, for example. But that's for further discussion, and we can talk about it when you're here. And I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. I look forward to that for sure. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Yes, it's please, Tyler.
No. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm also refraining myself from going into because yeah, this is a topic very close to my heart, because I'm working with precisely with structuralist theories and how can they contribute to contemporary semiotics and especially biosemiotics in a way. So, but we will have some discussion.
Yeah.
soon.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And okay, so now then